Hey guys, your boy Hachobi, and today we got Totally Not Mars complete review, King Piccolo arc. Let's get into it.
This video is brought to you by Manscaped.com, the global brand for men's grooming and hygiene products. We've seen some incredible narrative moments, thrilling fights, and touching scenes overflowing with emotion throughout our journey. But today, we'll be saving the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at the home stretch. Please remain seated for the purposes of this review and keep your arms and legs inside the ride at all times, because today we're taking down the evil Piccolo in what I believe to be an often unexplored portion of Dragon Ball's story. The stakes have never been higher and the tone so dark. Everyone, it's time. Let's defeat Piccolo and save the world. Something I think Akira Toriyama is unreasonably adept at pulling off is the tying of story beats together seamlessly despite not having prior planning for a long-term story. In other words, he's really good at making it up as he goes, to varying degrees of success, of course. Take, for example, Goku's Grandpa Gohan and the subplot contained therein. Starting off the story, he may have had the idea of what to do with that information, but throughout the story, it linked Goku with so many other characters until eventually, 100 chapters later, it gets paid off in this fashion. And it's spectacular. At the best of times, Dragon Ball can give the impression of a well-conceived and thoughtfully mapped-out story set in rich and vibrant worlds populated by wonderful characters. But in the first chapter of the King Piccolo arc, chapter 135, we see a perfect case study demonstrating the advantages and disadvantages of this very narrative approach, which haunts the foundations of this arc. Introduced during the Fortune Teller Baba material is this line, and with it a sense of foreboding prophecy. Similar to the other events in the narrative, this piece of dialogue acts as a loose piece of exposition meant to establish the idea that Goku will one day save the world from a great evil. And following the 22nd Tenkaichi Budokai, observant fans like you might notice that this event being set up right here perfectly fits that premonition's vague outline while also nicely coinciding with the climax of Master Roshi's contribution to the series, setting him up for something significant to contribute to this arc also. Having symbolically handed over the reins to the younger generation during the tournament, this opening chapter's strongest facet comes, I think, specifically from Roshi's point of view and the ominous revelations that are communicated to us through it after he realizes who's behind Krillin's death. Something Toriyama is clearly going for with this chapter is to instill a very different and significantly more serious tone following the comparatively light and invigorating 22nd Tenkaichi Budokai. The first half of this chapter concerning Roshi is filled with grim mystery, tragedy, and history concerning his former master and the implementation of the Mafuba technique to lock Piccolo away for good. It does a terrific job in introducing the immediate concern. We have a natural escalation of stakes following a shocking and emotionally charged moment. It verifies the authenticity of Baba's premonition, and it involves the participation of Roshi, a character that's clearly about to reach his emotional climax in the series. It's stupendous. The story in question kicks off perhaps better than any other arc in early Dragon Ball also. It's impactful and compelling immediately, bouncing off the climax to an incredible tournament and into something significantly darker than we've ever experienced before. And fittingly, Goku's disposition is affected tremendously as a result of this sudden shift in tone. He's filled with aggression, rage, and vengeance, all fueled by the sudden death of his best friend, Krillin. It's understandable, it's relatable, and it puts Goku immediately on the back foot with the likes of Tambourine, thanks to him being drained from the finals match he had moments prior with Ten Shinhan. And by the way, these right here, the two Tambourine fights, they are, in my opinion, the most emotionally charged fights of this arc, and feel all the better for being such. Throughout these fights with Tambourine, Goku shows more anger and resentment than we've ever seen him express, and Toriyama does an incredible job at conveying that on the page, making the occasion feel all the more impactful and important. There are certain panels that, just by looking at them, you can see Goku oozing aggression and hatred, particularly
I am Loki, and it is adorable that you think you could manipulate me.
particularly if you compare them to how he looked during the arc prior. This is new, and in feeling this, perhaps for the very first time, Goku acts irrationally on pure emotion, leading to all sorts of conflict within this narrative, which is a terrific example of character writing leading the narrative. It's incredible, and I love this choice of storytelling, but it does also have its downsides, so let's explore some that I noticed. The first issue with this arc made itself known to me by way of the introduction to the titular antagonist of the arc, King Piccolo himself, and regrettably I think it's one of the clearest examples of what happens when Toriyama's lack of planning comes to bite him back. Within this introduction, both Piccolo and the Pilaf gang in extremely unnatural dialogue start divulging the necessary information to us as readers or viewers. They are talking the story at us, and certainly not the intimidating or imposing sort of first impression we were expecting. Explaining that they found and released Piccolo, okay, and that's never explained, which is rather unfortunate and transparent considering the Pilaf gang play virtually no role in the story outside of acting as a plot device that allows Piccolo to get up to date and speed with the present day's activities. Following the visceral, rich, and powerful display of emotion shown by Goku and Roshi moments prior, this scene lands entirely flat, totally sucking the air out of what should be an impressive and intimidating unveiling of the most powerful and evil character the series has ever seen.
Yo, when Cell did that, my god.
Thankfully, however, Toriyama seems to have on some level registered this too, as from this moment on throughout Z, every major villain either gets established in the arc's lead-up, makes an impressive or intimidating entrance out of nowhere, or sometimes both. You see, the trouble with villain-focused arcs like these is that the structure of them feel very, well, for lack of a better term, predetermined. And because of that, we know going into the story that Goku will meet some trouble early on and then eventually overcome said trouble to win the day. This isn't something unique to Dragon Ball, it's a very common story format, and so it's how you disguise that obvious conclusion looming ahead that makes for great stories, I think. In the Frieza saga, we knew Goku would win the day eventually, but we had no idea how he would manage to pull it out of the bag in the end. And through numerous ups, downs, swerves, and near falls, Toriyama manages our expectations for that arc and its finale beautifully, much the same way he does with the likes of Vegeta and Cell also. But with this being his very first arc venturing into this villain format, it very much felt like a traditional and in some ways hollow version of what he would later perform to greater effect in Z, and unfortunately because it shares the exact same format, it's difficult not to compare this with the best of Z. And I think that's a good example of what I perceive to be the primary issue with this arc. It tells an incredibly simple story in the most predictable way possible. There's no deeper complexity or any subversive nature of any sort, and the story it does tell doesn't connect enough plot threads to feel as meaningful as I sincerely expected it to. As I said, the story from the get-go was of course going to involve Goku rushing out to try and defeat the big bad. Piccolo would of course defeat him early. In response to this, Goku will gain a new power or train or something, and then fight Piccolo again. The framework is obvious, but there's a lot of room for interesting storytelling, and while there are wonderful additions to the story to help break up the main plot thread, it never managed to gain any sort of earned momentum leading up to the finale. Instead, opting to leverage established masters to create larger tension
I do agree
and
with
contrived
you.
power.
He didn't get the greatest opening.
Throughout this retrospective review of the series, Roshi has been a character that's consistently blown me away time and time again, with not only how pervasive he is throughout the narrative, but how impactful he can be also. The prior two tournament arcs are elevated tremendously simply by his presence, and even his added commentary during Baba enhanced that experience also. But in this arc, his placement and contribution to the narrative feels a lot less impactful than I was anticipating it to be. Now, it's important for me at this point to highlight a distinction in what I'm saying. I did not expect him to play a pivotal role in the downfall of Piccolo directly. In fact, given the prevailing narrative throughout, I fully expected this to fall on the younger generation, with this effectively being his passing of the torch once he fails to eventually stop Piccolo, which I still feel is one of the strongest points of this arc, by the way. And yet, despite enjoying the history offered by Roshi at the beginning and his speech following his failure to defeat Piccolo, I felt as though something key was lacking. There was a considerable amount of time early on dedicated to explaining the history of and exploring the risks surrounding the Mafuba technique. In this story, we've seen glimpses into Roshi's past through individuals remarking on his legacy like Yamcha, those at the Tenkaichi Budokai talking about him, and even Korin when he would speak of Roshi's time spent with him. And when we finally get to see a flashback into Roshi's time spent training as a young man under his mentor, we learn of the technique, the Mafuba, a move that thematically represents the passing of the torch to the next generation, a move move he learned from his master and one Roshi eventually passes on to Tenshinhan when he tries to master it in time to make a difference. It's a wonderful technique that ties into the villain, and it's thematically consistent with what Roshi represents in this series, the adoption of responsibility. It's perfect. But it plays little to no role in the wider arc. Maybe it's because it doesn't make for an impactful or impressive finish to the final battle, but it's the failure of the Mafaba, a technique that represents inheritance in the series, which highlights for me the weakness of this arc. It doesn't feel like it's connected its plot threads to tell a greater story. Nothing Roshi does contributes to the ending of this arc besides putting Tenshinhan to sleep with sleeping gas he for some reason has in his possession, and maybe providing greater motivation for Goku after his death. I personally found both Roshi and Goku's response to the news of Krillin's death and Piccolo's influence to be really interesting. Roshi pretty much embodied fear and restraint, while Goku represents naive impulsivity and unrestrained anger. He snaps at Goku during the beginning of this material, ordering him not to charge in emotional and totally exhausted. And this was something I thought could have made for a nice point of connection or contention between Goku and Roshi in this story, but instead, this is the last time they share the screen together, and it's at the beginning of the arc. And not just that, Goku almost makes the exact same mistake again when he realizes Roshi and Chaozu were killed by Piccolo. Only this time, with no intervention and without any reason really, he stops when Korin asks him to. I thought the means with which Goku's emotions were used in the wider arc were, in a word, less than ideal. And that despite the clunky nature the villain of the arc was introduced with, he still had a phenomenal showing against Goku one-on-one, setting the stage for what could become one of, if not the most emotionally resonant conflicts of the series to date, eclipsing what Goku might have felt avenging Krillin's death. And the moment this arc nosedives for me personally comes during this scene with Korin. After being beaten to within an inch of death, courtesy of King Piccolo, Yajirobe carries Goku to the top of Korin Tower for a senzu bean and training. This was a great choice, I thought. It included pre-established settings and persons to further the story, making the world feel lived in. But when Goku hears that Piccolo killed both Roshi and Chaozu, he also gets seriously angry while atop Korin Tower. This was something I thought would have made sense to be a significant moment. One that could have given this arc some sort of narrative cohesion, connecting all of the characters together. Roshi might very well have lived had Goku restrained himself appropriately within this arc, but this facet is never addressed. Roshi dies because he believes that he needs to do something. He's left to take action in a way he definitely didn't want to have to do, and in a way Goku, in his naive and emotional outburst at the beginning, is connected to that happening. But that point is never developed on or explored within this arc. Instead, Goku manages to restrain himself in time to listen to Korin, and because of this, it felt significantly less weighty than it otherwise stood to be, in my opinion. And once he does restrain himself, the story cascades into a battle made possible thanks to a convoluted and, I might even argue, lazy power-up. There might be a connection made thematically between this risk Goku was willing to take in drinking this poison water and the risk Roshi took with the Mafaba, but really that feels a little forced and somewhat of a stretch to me. And so, all in all, going into this final battle, despite the stakes never being higher and the consequences of the events never yielding a higher body count, with everyone's fate left in an uncertain tizzy thanks to the destruction of the Dragon Balls, I couldn't help but feel that something was lacking going into the final fight. And once that fight does get underway, the bad and the brilliant of this arc are clear as day. Last time I touched on Manscaped, I spoke about how they launched the fancy Lawnmower 4.0, but did you know? Goku vs. King Piccolo. I think this arc, as well as this fight, have a lot of upsides. The artwork is incredible throughout. It incorporates secondary characters to some extent, like Tenshinhan and Yajirobe, who is just a treasure that needs to be preserved. I swear, the time he spent with Goku in the forest is always a joy to read through. The two characters are strangely similar in a lot of ways and different in others, making for this surprisingly effective fraternal relationship. But yes, it has a lot of upsides, and I'm sure it's most definitely the favorite fight of many of you watching right now. And I think that's great. I can't take that away from you. But for me, unlike the rest of this review series where I've been pleasantly surprised by how well all of this holds up, this fight fell a little flat for me. I started this review by highlighting the fact that Akira Toriyama famously and notoriously likes to take a more relaxed approach when writing his stories. Sometimes this works out tremendously, but sometimes it yields a series of choices that feel immensely contrived. For instance, let's take a look at what's needed to happen in order to get to this fight with Piccolo in the first place. And bear in mind, I am being a little nitpicky here, but it's just to prove a greater point.
Okay.
Number 1. Piccolo was released, and we have no idea how the Pilaf gang knew or how they managed to achieve this. Where did they find the rice cooker housing him? How could they possibly make this happen? All of these questions are simply hand-waved away in the opening chapters. Number 2. The first fight Goku has with old Piccolo in the woods alongside Yajirobe is preposterously fortuitous for the young monkey boy. The only reason Goku survives is due to his heart stopping at the exact moment Piccolo checks to see if he's alive. And as soon as Piccolo leaves, suddenly Goku comes back to life. Number 3. Now completely drained of energy with no means of transportation, he not only happens to luckily be in the company of someone he randomly met in the woods, but that random person he met also possesses the immense strength necessary not only to climb Korin Tower, a feat that has only been achieved by Goku in recent memory for those concerning it, but he also does so while carrying Goku on his back. And finally, number 4. After arriving at the top of Korin Tower with the anticipation of receiving more training, Korin reveals that he can't train Goku anymore, but he just so happens to have a magical water that can unlock Goku's hidden potential and elevate his strength to where he can fight a newly rejuvenated King Piccolo. Space Jam did the same thing as a gag in the 90s, but this is a legitimate plot point in this story, one which makes the climax possible, and that's hard to get past. These aren't minor plot points that only become apparent when you look for them. These are major story beats responsible for every major event outside of Roshi's portion of the narrative, which, as I discussed earlier, doesn't play nearly as large a role as I thought it would going into it. But that's a personal gripe. How does this final fight, this climactic battle between Piccolo and Goku, play out? King Piccolo versus Son Goku. The fight is stunning in terms of choreography on display. Despite my waning investment on an emotional front, this is, once again, the beginning of what will become a trend moving forward with strong and imposing villains leading the charge of arcs, creating magnificent moments and snapshots in manga history. Piccolo, Vegeta, Frieza, Cell, and Majin Buu, this evil character type for Goku to focus on and fight against starts here. And as I mentioned, the implementation of Tenshinhan in this final fight, both to save Goku and to add further complications, was a wonderful way to bring some emotion back to the conflict, with it leading to the stakes being brought to the forefront for Goku once again, having to come to terms with the notion that Roshi, Chaozu, and Krillin are potentially gone forever. Goku now is no longer fighting for them, but instead to prevent any more destruction being done to the rest of the world, which is a wonderful lesson and sense of responsibility for Goku to adopt now as the Earth's primary defender. Climaxing in spectacular fashion as Goku, armed with just one arm left, uses the technique passed down to him by Roshi to take out the greatest threat the Earth's ever seen. And as soon as the fight ends, Goku's face crumbles as he's overcome by the emotion of the occasion. On its own, this moment or series of moments are utterly spectacular, and exactly what I wanted from this story day one. And to its credit, in addition to Goku's story of inheritance and responsibility, King Piccolo also has his moment to shine as he births a new son, one with whom he unloads his own brand of responsibility. One day, my son, you'll avenge your father's death. Don't let the fire of evil die out. And this for me highlights the greatest strength of not just this arc, but really all of classic Dragon Ball, including Z. It's its ability to seamlessly tie every arc together as if it were meant to be, from the start, one large story informed by the events that just happened. And nowhere is that more true than in this arc closing off with King Piccolo. Following the hatching of his cute Piccolo Jr., there's a tremendous sense of relief, but also sorrow and lingering dread. The best decision Toriyama made during the material of this arc, I think, at least from a narrative perspective, has to be the measures King Piccolo took in destroying the Dragon Shenlong himself. It was something we never thought was even an option. It lended much needed weight to the final battle with Piccolo, first and foremost, but it also created believable and natural choices made by Goku in seeking out a means to circumvent this apparent roadblock, with him effectively still wanting to find a way to revive his lost friends and mentor. And the best part is that in order to reach this new level, never before seen by any character in this story, he has to use the relationships he's earned and cultivated with other people, he uses the good he's done to prove himself, and this is my favorite part, he has to use a weapon that's been part of him since day one, chapter one. Nyobo. Without any one of these, this would be impossible. The magical staff now provides with it a means with which to ascend to the next level, to meet with the individual who created the Dragon Balls in the hope that he might be able to provide a way to revive his lost friends. This is my favorite aspect of Dragon Ball's world building. This sort of expansive and otherworldly color added to the franchise through this particular way of reaching a new level. We've seen it with Korin Tower, and we've seen it with King Kai later in the story, and this is just another one of those examples. And watching as Goku, with the help of his Nyobo, soars through the clouds and into the unknown, I can only imagine the wondrous feeling that filled the people of Japan when the main character of this series not only has decided to meet with God, but has also earned the right to do so. The design of the lookout is awe-inspiring, and as Goku ascends the ladder using his tail to aid in that ascension, we see a strange-looking figure waiting for him. What sort of adventures await us in this retrospective review? Well, you'll have to wait and see. Overall, despite the length I went to explaining my issues with this part of the series, the King Piccolo arc honestly felt a lot more enjoyable than I remembered it being on my very first read-through all those years ago. I was able to cling on to characters of this story much more readily, and to be perfectly honest, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend Goku's first encounter with Yajirobe. Random as it might be, it's some light and fun banter between two characters that rarely ever get to speak to each other, but have such a fun chemistry. The story, sometimes in minor and others in massive ways, seems to take shortcuts, but as made evident by the sheer number of people out there that love this arc for all the reasons I praised it for in this video, it definitely has something to offer and should not be overlooked even by the most nitpicky of anime fans. It's a key part of the Dragon Ball story that set the trend for evil villains far into the future, and one that makes the next arc possible.
Well, thank you, Totally Not Mark. I appreciate that. I can't wait for part 5. Go subscribe to Totally Not Mark. Subscribe to me. Please like, comment, subscribe. That's your boy, How Should It Be. And we're out. Peace.